Commas are very useful for separating items in a list, and we'll have a look here at two rules related to this general pattern. So first of all, in this example, we have three items in our list, three nouns. Niagara Falls, item number 1, the CN Tower, number 2, and the Rocky Mountains, number 3. And we've put a comma between each of these items to separate them. Now, you might be thinking, well, I have learned in the past that this last comma is not really necessary. Do we really need that last comma? And you would be right that there's a lot of dispute about that. In fact, this comma is often called the serial, this kind of serial, or Oxford comma. And not everybody agrees that the Oxford comma is completely necessary. The reason why we do have it, and it's the general trend these days, especially in style books and classrooms, is to add the Oxford comma. But you don't absolutely have to, so it sort of depends on context. But the general trend is to add it because it provides a little bit more clarity, and you can see that in the second example here. So if we were to say, I had lunch with a professor of criminology, comma, a crack addict and a cheat, then it might be confusing because it might sound like this last phrase is actually describing the professor of criminology, and it's acting as if it is an appositive. So an appositive, just to remind you, is that noun or noun phrase that renames an earlier noun or noun phrase. So to avoid this confusion, we can add a comma right there, and then there's no problem at all. This kind of instance is very rare, and those people who love the Oxford comma are always coming up with examples to show why it's needed. But most of the time you would be perfectly fine to leave the comma out. So our suggestion is, if you want to play it safe, go with the Oxford comma. If you feel that you want your style a little bit more open, and perhaps you're writing for a more popular kind of publication rather than a formal one, then leave the Oxford comma out, and it's not a huge deal. And that brings us to our second rule, which has to do with the order of adjectives. Now, I should say right off the bat that this rule always gives me trouble. I've taught this for many years, and it can still be difficult to tell the difference between the two kinds of adjectives that we're going to touch on here. So don't be worried if you have some issues with this, if you find it tricky to spot the difference. A lot of people struggle with this. But that doesn't mean we have to ignore it, so let's jump right in, and we're going to talk about the difference between cumulative and coordinate adjectives. Okay, it's best just to look at an example here. So let's read the sentence. It goes, in his thoughtful, meticulous way, my kind, clever grandfather gave me a fancy Japanese sword and some shiny green shoelaces. Now if you look at the first example here, so thoughtful, meticulous way, we have two adjectives, thoughtful and meticulous, and they are both modifying a noun, which is way. These adjectives are called coordinate because you can organize them in any order. So it doesn't matter which one you put first, and they are both equally modifying the noun. They're kind of doing it separately, and they don't have much interaction with each other. That's why we can put a comma between them. There are a couple of tests you can do to figure out if the adjective is coordinate or cumulative. So if you can rearrange them, as I suggested, you can reorder them, then they are probably coordinate. And you could say in his meticulous, thoughtful way, and it wouldn't make a huge difference. The second test you can do is to put and in between them. So you could say in his thoughtful and meticulous way. Again, not a huge problem. So these tests are helpful. They won't always work, but they are helpful in figuring out if the adjectives are coordinate or cumulative. And we can go through the rest of the sentence now and see how this plays out. So we also have my kind, clever grandfather. So kind and clever, you can reorder these, right? You could say my kind and clever grandfather. You could say my clever kind grandfather, not a huge deal. Do notice though that my is technically an adjective as well, and you cannot reorder that, right? You can't say kind, clever, my grandfather. That doesn't go at the end. So we can't put a comma right after my. And you can see here how we can actually mix them together somewhat as well. Okay, then we get to a fancy Japanese sword. And now if we apply these tests, they don't work. So if you were to say a Japanese fancy sword, well, it doesn't quite work. And there is this kind of natural order to adjectives in the way we put them in the sentence. And in fact, an adjective that has to do with origin, so a country of origin, tends to come quite late in that order of adjectives. Some people would suggest that you memorize the order of adjectives. I think that's a useful or useless trick. I don't think there's some kind of magic to this. I think just applying these two tests that we've talked about is the best way you can go about it. But the order of adjectives is important because there is this sense in which the English language has that kind of natural order, and we don't want to disturb that too much. So our last sentence really shows that, or last part of the sentence. So if you say some shiny green shoelaces, then obviously some can not be moved at all. I mean, you can't say shiny green some shoelaces, but we can still look at the middle piece. And if we have a closer look at this, it would be hard to say some green shiny shoelaces or some shiny and green shoelaces. And the reason for that is that shiny is not just modifying shoelaces, sorry, it's also modifying green. What kind of green? It's a shiny kind of green. And because of that, the word cumulative is really appropriate here, because these adjectives, they don't just separately modify the noun, but it's almost as if they're building on each other. They're helping each other out to do the job. And so they kind of accumulate over time, and then they get to the noun. Okay? And that's why we don't want those commas between cumulative adjectives. Hopefully that makes some sense. And again, this is a pattern that's useful, but you really have to learn to recognize it. And I think sometimes grammar is a bit like wine tasting. There's a little bit of room for disagreement here about what is good and what works and what does not. So use the rule, apply it, but use it as a guideline, and you're still going to have to use your own judgment